In the vast chronicles of Westeros, few creatures command such reverence and terror as the dragons of House Targaryen. From the ancient volcanic peaks of Old Valyria to the windswept shores of Dragonstone, these magnificent beasts shaped the destiny of kingdoms and emperors alike. Their flames forged empires and reduced castles to ash. Their wings cast shadows over entire cities, and their roars echoed through centuries of legend. Tonight, we journey through the histories of these legendary creatures, exploring their bonds with riders, their roles in conquest and civil war, and the enduring legacy they left upon the realm of Westeros. In the mists of ancient history, long before the Seven Kingdoms existed as we know them, the Valyrian Freehold stood as the greatest civilization the world had ever known. Built upon 40 families of dragon lords who wielded fire and blood as their birthright, this empire stretched across continents, its reach extending far beyond the smoking peninsula that gave it birth. The dragons that served these lords were creatures of pure magic, born from the fusion of fire and blood in rituals lost to time. Their scales gleamed like precious metals, their breath could melt stone, and their very presence commanded the elements themselves. Among the 40 families who ruled this magnificent empire, House Targaryen held a position of respect, though not supreme power. They were neither the greatest nor the most influential of the Dragonlord houses. Yet they possessed something that would prove more valuable than political dominance or military might. Within their bloodline flowed the gift of prophetic dreams, visions that could pierce the veil between present and future. This ancient magic manifested most powerfully in their daughters, women who bore the title of dreamers and whose visions shaped the family's destiny across generations. The dragons of Valyria were not mere animals, but partners in the truest sense, their intelligence rivaling that of their riders. Each dragon possessed its own personality, its own preferences and bonds that transcended simple training. The connection between dragon and rider formed through bloodline and ritual, creating partnerships that lasted lifetimes. These magnificent creatures came in countless varieties, their scales displaying every color imaginable, from deepest black to purest white, from emerald green to royal purple. Some grew to enormous size, their wingspans stretching across entire city blocks, while others remained smaller but no less deadly for their compact frames. The Targaryens maintained 5 great dragons in their household, each a testament to their family's power and prestige. Balerion, even then known for his massive size and black scales, served as the mount of Lord Aerion Targaryen. Vhagar, with her bronze coloring and fierce temperament, had bonded with Lady Valena Velaryon before her marriage into the Targaryen line. Meraxes, beautiful and swift with silver scales that caught the light like quicksilver, flew with various family members as need demanded. 2 other dragons whose names have been lost to history completed their stable, creatures whose bloodlines would have enriched the Valyrian dragon population for generations to come. The gift of prophetic sight that marked the Targaryen bloodline reached its greatest expression in Daenerys Targaryen, a young woman whose visions would save her entire family from destruction. Born into privilege and power in the heart of the Freehold, Daenerys began experiencing dreams of unusual clarity and disturbing content. Night after night, she witnessed visions of fire and ash, of the great city of Valyria consumed in flames that burned so hot they melted stone and metal into rivers of molten destruction. In her dreams, she saw the 40 families perish, their dragons falling from the sky like burning stars, their great palaces crumbling into the earth as volcanic fury reshaped the very landscape. These visions tormented Daenerys for months as she struggled to understand their meaning. The images were too vivid to dismiss as mere nightmares, too consistent to ignore as fantasy. She saw the 14 flames, the ring of volcanoes that surrounded Valyria, erupting in unison with a violence that defied comprehension. She witnessed the sea boiling, turning to steam as molten rock poured into its depths. Most terrifying of all, she saw her own family among the victims, unless they acted upon her warnings. When Daenerys finally shared her visions with her father, Lord Aenar Targaryen, the family faced an impossible decision. To abandon Valyria meant leaving behind everything they had built over centuries of careful cultivation. Their estates, their political alliances, their position within the freehold's hierarchy would all be forfeit. Yet Dany spoke with such conviction, described her dreams with such horrifying detail, that Lord Aenar could not dismiss them as the fantasies of a troubled mind. The gift of prophetic sight ran strong in Targaryen blood, and her father had learned to trust the visions that came to their family's dreamers. The decision to leave Valyria required careful planning and tremendous sacrifice. The family could not simply announce their departure without raising questions that might panic other noble houses or alert rivals to their prophetic abilities. Instead, they began a gradual withdrawal, selling properties discreetly and transferring assets to their holdings on Dragonstone. This ancient fortress, perched on a volcanic island in Blackwater Bay, had served as their westernmost outpost for generations. Its remote location and defensible position made it ideal for what they planned to attempt. The most challenging aspect of their exodus involved the dragons themselves. Moving 5 adult dragons required exceptional secrecy and coordination. Each creature needed to be transported without drawing attention from the other Dragonlord families who might question such unusual activity. The Targaryens accomplished this feat through a series of carefully planned flights, spacing the departures over several months to avoid suspicion. Balerion, already the largest of their dragons, required special consideration due to his immense size and the attention his flight would inevitably attract. As the family completed their preparations, Daenerys continued to experience her prophetic dreams with increasing intensity. The visions showed not just the destruction of Valyria, but glimpses of what lay beyond that catastrophe. She saw dragons flying over lands of ice and fire, witnessed great battles fought in skies above foreign kingdoms, and observed crown and throne that would one day bear the mark of Targaryen rule. These images both terrified and inspired her, suggesting that their exile would lead not to obscurity but to destiny beyond imagination. The final departure from Valyria proved emotional for every family member. Lord Aenar took one last look at the Great Pyramid that had housed his ancestors for centuries, while his wife, Lady Valena, whispered farewell to the garden where their children had played. Their young son Aegon, barely more than a boy, watched the receding coastline with tears in eyes, unable to understand why they were abandoning the only home he had ever known. Only Daenerys felt relief as the familiar skyline disappeared behind them, knowing that her family had escaped the doom that awaited their former neighbors. The journey to Dragonstone took several days, as the dragons carried their riders and essential possessions across the summer sea. The family's treasure, accumulated over generations of service to the freehold, filled the cargo holds of ships that followed in the dragon's wake. Ancient tomes of dragon lore, weapons forged with Valyrian steel, and artifacts of power accompanied them into exile. Most precious of all were the dragon eggs they brought, some quickened with life and others waiting for the proper time to hatch. Dragonstone welcomed them with the familiar scent of sulfur and salt spray, its massive towers carved from the living rock of the mountainside. The castle's dragon motifs, sculpted by craftsmen who understood the creature's true nature, seemed appropriate for their new circumstances. Here they would rebuild. Here they would wait. And here they would prepare for whatever future Daenerys continued to glimpse in her dreams. The fortress became their sanctuary, its halls echoing with dragon roars instead of the refined conversations of Valyrian court life. 12 years passed in relative quiet as the Targaryens established their new life on Dragonstone. Their dragons thrived in the volcanic environment, finding caves and perches among the island's peaks where they could rest between flights. The family maintained their traditions and customs, teaching their children the high Valyrian tongue and the ancient ways of dragon mastery. They remained in contact with some Valyrian merchants and maintained awareness of political developments in their former homeland, though they took care to avoid drawing attention to their exile. Then, in a single day, Daenerys' prophecy fulfilled itself with horrifying accuracy. The doom of Valyria struck without warning as the 14 flames erupted simultaneously, their combined fury reshaping the very geography of the known world. The great city vanished beneath rivers of molten rock, while tsunamis devastated coastlines thousands of miles away. The 40 Dragonlord families perished in minutes, their centuries of accumulated power and knowledge lost forever. The dragons that had once filled the skies above Valyria fell dead or fled mad into the wilderness, their magic broken by the cataclysmic forces unleashed beneath their feet. When the news reached Dragonstone weeks later, through traumatized survivors and fleeing merchants, the Targaryen family gathered in the castle's great hall to mourn their former homeland. Lord Einar spoke of relatives and friends who had dismissed his daughter's warnings, while Lady Valena wept for the gardens and libraries that would never bloom again. Yet beneath their grief lay the profound realization that they had become something unique in all the world. House Targaryen now stood as the last dragon lords, the sole keepers of the ancient bond between human and dragon. Their 5 surviving dragons represented the entire remaining population of these magical creatures. Balerion had grown even larger during their years of exile, his black scales gleaming with health and his temperament mellowing into the confidence of absolute dominance. Vhagar continued to display the fierce loyalty that had marked her service to the family, her bronze coloring deepening with age and experience. Meraxes maintained her elegant beauty, her silver scales catching the light of Dragonstone's torches as she glided between the castle's towers. The 2 unnamed dragons, though smaller than their famous companions, carried themselves with the dignity of creatures who knew their profound importance to their family's survival. The weight of their unique position began to settle upon the Targaryens as months turned to years. They were no longer simply one noble house among many, but the guardians of an entire species and the inheritors of knowledge that had died with Valyria. The responsibility proved both inspiring and terrifying, driving them to document everything they could remember about dragon care and breeding. They transcribed ancient songs, recorded feeding habits and mating behaviors, and preserved the rituals that bound dragon to rider through sacred ceremony and shared blood. As young Aegon matured into manhood during these years of isolation, his ambition grew alongside his understanding of their family's unprecedented position. The dreams that had saved them from destruction now showed him visions of conquest and crown, of dragons flying over castles that had never known their shadow. He watched the quarreling kingdoms of Westeros from afar, observing their endless wars and petty disputes with the calculating eye of a future conqueror. The boy who had wept at leaving Valyria was transforming into a man who would use their exile as the foundation for an empire greater than anything the Freehold had achieved. The transformation of House Targaryen, from Valyrian nobles to the last dragon lords, marked more than a change in circumstances. It represented the birth of a dynasty that would reshape the Western world, the beginning of a legend that would echo through centuries of conquest and civil war. In their isolation on Dragonstone, surrounded by the volcanic fury that mirrored their lost homeland, the family prepared for a destiny that none could yet fully comprehend. The dragons that had once been merely symbols of their status were becoming the instruments of a transformation that would unite 7 kingdoms under a single crown and establish a reign that would endure for nearly 3 centuries. By the time Aegon Targaryen reached his maturity in the early years after the Doom, the political landscape of Westeros had settled into a familiar pattern of division and conflict. 7 distinct kingdoms ruled the continent, each jealously guarding its independence while engaging in endless wars and shifting alliances. The Storm King held dominion over the rain-swept lands of the East, his seat at Storm's End standing defiant against both sea and enemy. In the West, the Rock King commanded vast wealth from the gold mines of Casterly Rock, his Lannister banners flying over the most prosperous lands in Westeros. The Reach bloomed under the rule of House Gardener, whose kings commanded the largest armies and most fertile territories, while the Iron Islands bred raiders and reavers under the savage rule of House Hoare. The North remained under Stark dominion, its vast wilderness and harsh climate breeding a people as hard as winter itself. The Vale of Arryn stood proud and isolated behind its mountain walls, its nobles considering themselves above the petty conflicts of the lowlands. Most ambitious of all was Harren the Black, who ruled not just the Iron Islands, but vast stretches of the Riverlands as well. His power consolidated in the massive fortress of Harrenhal, a castle so large it had taken decades to complete, and housed thousands of retainers within its towering walls. From his seat on Dragonstone, Aegon observed this fractured realm with the calculating eye of a conqueror. Unlike the kings of the 7 kingdoms, who viewed each other as rivals to be defeated or allies to be courted, Aegon saw opportunity in their division. His dragons had grown to full maturity during the years since his family's exile, and their power represented something entirely new to the political equation of Westeros. No castle could stand against dragonfire, no army could march beneath a sky filled with flame, and no king could claim divine mandate when faced with creatures that commanded the very elements. The decision to launch his conquest came not from sudden ambition, but from careful calculation and years of planning. Aegon had studied the strengths and weaknesses of each kingdom, analyzing their military capabilities, their political structures, and the personalities of their rulers. He understood that traditional conquest through ground forces alone would require decades of warfare and cost countless lives. The dragons offered a different path, one that could minimize bloodshed while demonstrating the futility of resistance against creatures of such overwhelming power. When Aegon finally departed Dragonstone to begin his conquest, he carried with him more than military might. His sister wives, Visenya and Rhaenys, had become accomplished dragon riders in their own right, their bonds with Vhagar and Meraxes representing the full strength of the last Dragonlord family. Visenya, the elder of his sisters, had developed into a formidable warrior whose skill with blade and fire matched her fierce temperament. Her dragon Vhagar reflected these qualities, displaying an aggressiveness in battle that complemented her rider's martial prowess. Rhaenys, younger and more diplomatically inclined, brought different strengths to their campaign. Her dragon Meraxes possessed a grace and beauty that could inspire as well as intimidate, making her ideal for the delicate work of accepting surrenders and negotiating terms with defeated enemies. Where Visenya represented the iron fist of Targaryen power, Rhaenys embodied the silk glove that could make submission seem like honor rather than defeat. Balerion, grown to enormous proportions during his years on Dragonstone, served as both Aegon's mount and the ultimate symbol of their family's power. The Black Dread had achieved a size that dwarfed even the largest dragons of ancient Valyria, his wingspan creating shadows that could engulf entire settlements when he passed overhead. His breath burned black and red, flames so intense they could melt stone and reduce iron to liquid metal. When Balerion roared, the sound carried for miles, a primal expression of power that reached something deep and ancient in the human soul. The conquest began at Blackwater Rush, where Aegon first set foot on Westerosi soil with conquest in mind. His landing was calculated to position him within striking distance of multiple kingdoms while avoiding immediate confrontation with any single enemy. The Riverlands, long oppressed under Harren the Black's rule, provided ideal territory for demonstrating the benefits of Targaryen rule. Many river lords, tired of paying tribute to the Iron Islands, proved receptive to the idea of new leadership backed by dragon power. Aegon's first target was the most ambitious, a statement that would echo throughout Westeros and demonstrate the futility of resistance against dragon fire. Harrenhal stood as the largest castle in the Seven Kingdoms, its massive walls and towering spires representing the pinnacle of defensive architecture. Harren the Black had boasted that his fortress could withstand any siege, that his walls were too high for ladders and too thick for rams, that he could house his entire army within its protection, while besiegers starved outside its gates. The siege of Harrenhal lasted exactly one night. As darkness fell over the Riverlands, Balerion appeared above the castle like a shadow given form and substance. Harren the Black and his sons gathered on the tallest tower to witness this impossible sight, perhaps believing that even a dragon could not breach their mighty walls. They learned otherwise in moments that followed, as Balerion's breath transformed their impregnable fortress into a furnace of melted stone and flowing metal. The psychological impact of Harrenhal's destruction exceeded even its strategic value. Word spread throughout Westeros of the castle's fate, carried by survivors and witnesses who described scenes that challenged comprehension. Lords who had never seen a dragon suddenly understood the reality they faced, while common people whispered of ancient prophecies fulfilled and gods walking among mortals once again. The burning of Harrenhal announced to every kingdom that the age of traditional warfare had ended, replaced by something far more immediate and terrible. Following this devastating demonstration, Aegon turned his attention to the kingdoms themselves, beginning with those whose rulers showed the greatest willingness to negotiate. The Storm King Argilac, the Arrogant initially attempted to forge an alliance through marriage, offering his daughter to Aegon in exchange for recognition of his continued rule. When Aegon proposed instead that the princess marry his bastard brother Orys Baratheon, Argilac's pride overcame his political wisdom, leading him to reject the offer and prepare for war. The battle that followed showcased the devastating effectiveness of coordinated dragon warfare. Aegon's forces, though smaller than the Storm King's army, positioned themselves with tactical precision while the three dragons circled overhead. When the fighting began, Balerion, Vhagar, and Meraxes struck in sequence, their coordinated assault breaking the enemy formation and routing an army that had never faced such overwhelming force. Argilac the Arrogant fell with sword in hand, his defiance earning respect even from his conquerors. The submission of the Reach required different tactics, as King Mern commanded the largest army in Westeros, supported by considerable wealth and the loyalty of numerous vassals. At the Field of Fire, this massive host faced Aegon's much smaller force in what appeared to be certain victory for the Reach. The battle began conventionally with charges of heavy cavalry and formations of spearmen clashing across the burned grassland. Then the dragons arrived overhead, and conventional warfare transformed into systematic slaughter. The three great beasts worked in perfect coordination, their flames creating a wall of fire that trapped the enemy army while systematically eliminating any organized resistance. King Mern perished alongside his sons and heirs, while thousands of his soldiers fled in terror from an enemy they had no means of fighting. The wealth and power of the Reach, accumulated over centuries of prosperity, submitted to dragon fire in a single afternoon of systematic destruction. The conquest of the Rock proved less dramatic but equally decisive when King Loren Lannister, having witnessed the fate of his allies, chose submission over destruction. The sight of the three dragons landing outside the gates of Casterly Rock convinced the Lannister king that resistance would serve only to destroy his people without achieving any meaningful victory. His surrender preserved his family's wealth and position, while demonstrating the wisdom that would characterize House Lannister's approach to Targaryen rule for generations to come. In the north, King Torrhen Stark faced perhaps the most difficult decision of any Westerosi ruler. His kingdom's vast distances and harsh climate might have provided advantages in a conventional war, but dragons could cross these obstacles as easily as they crossed rivers or mountains. When word reached Winterfell of the Southern Kingdom's submission, the king in the north gathered his banners for what many expected to be a final, desperate stand against the invaders. The meeting between Torrhen Stark and Aegon Targaryen took place not on a battlefield but in a pavilion erected on neutral ground, where the two kings could speak as equals despite the dragons circling overhead. Aegon's offer was simple but comprehensive, promising to preserve northern autonomy in exchange for acknowledgement of Targaryen supremacy. The king in the north, remembered forever after as the king who knelt, chose his people's survival over his own pride, bending the knee in a ceremony that united 6 of the 7 kingdoms under a single crown. The Vale of Arryn's submission required a more dramatic demonstration, as young King Ronal Arryn initially believed his mountain fortress provided immunity from dragon attack. Queen Visenya and Vhagar proved this assumption false in spectacular fashion, landing within the Eyrie's supposedly impregnable courtyard, while the court looked on in amazement. The sight of a fully grown dragon perched among the towers of his ancestral seat convinced the boy king that surrender offered better prospects than defiance, though his mother, the Queen Regent, required more persuasion before accepting the new reality. Only Dorne continued to resist Targaryen rule, its princes and princesses choosing guerrilla warfare over open battle when faced with dragons that could not be fought through conventional means. The Dornish strategy of retreat and harassment proved effective against ground forces, but ultimately futile when dragons could pursue fleeing enemies across any terrain. However, their resistance would extract a price that haunted the Targaryen family for generations. A cost that transformed triumph into tragedy during what should have been the completion of their conquest. The 3 dragons that conquered Westeros had proven themselves more than mere weapons of war. They were partners in the truest sense, creatures whose intelligence and loyalty enabled achievements that would have been impossible through force alone. Their bond with the Targaryen siblings represented something sacred, a connection that transcended the normal relationship between human and animal. Together, they had united a fractured continent under a single crown, establishing a dynasty that would rule for nearly 3 centuries and leaving a legacy that would echo through the ages. The death of Aegon the Conqueror in 37 AC marked not the end of dragon power, but its evolution under new circumstances that would test both the creatures and their riders in ways the conquest had never demanded. King Aenys Targaryen, Aegon's eldest son, inherited not just the Iron Throne, but the immense responsibility of maintaining unity among 7 kingdoms that had been forced together through dragonfire rather than mutual agreement. The realm that had submitted to overwhelming force now faced the question of whether it would remain loyal to a gentler hand that preferred compromise to conquest. Balerion the Black Dread, now approaching his 100th year of life, had grown even more massive during the years following the conquest. Those who remembered him from the early days of Aegon's campaign marveled at his continued growth, noting that his skull alone had reached proportions that dwarfed the largest war horses. His black scales had taken on a deep, lustrous quality that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, while his eyes burned with the same fierce intelligence that had characterized his partnership with the Conqueror. Despite his advancing age, Balerion remained the most formidable dragon in the world, his mere presence sufficient to remind potential rebels of the power that enforced Targaryen rule. Under King Aenys, however, Balerion's role shifted from active conquest to symbolic deterrence. The new king preferred negotiation to intimidation, seeking to win the loyalty of his subjects through justice and mercy rather than fear. This approach proved both admirable and problematic, as various factions began to test the limits of royal authority. The Faith Militant, a religious movement that had been suppressed during Aegon's reign, emerged from hiding to challenge what they saw as the abominations of Targaryen rule, particularly the practice of sibling marriage that they claimed violated the natural order. When Prince Aegon, the Uncrowned, son of King Aenys, bonded with the young dragon Quicksilver, the realm witnessed the first new dragon rider pairing since the conquest. Quicksilver, hatched on Dragonstone in 7 AC, possessed silver scales that gleamed like polished metal and a grace in flight that rivaled even Meraxes. The bond between prince and dragon represented hope for the future of the dynasty, suggesting that the gift of dragon mastery would pass successfully to the next generation of Targaryens. The relationship between Quicksilver and Prince Aegon demonstrated the unique qualities that distinguished each dragon rider partnership. Where Balerion's bond with the Conqueror had been built on mutual respect between equals, Quicksilver's connection with the young prince reflected the enthusiasm and energy of youth. The dragon delighted in aerial acrobatics that showcased her agility, performing maneuvers that larger dragons could never attempt. Prince Aegon, inspired by his mount's grace and speed, developed a flying style that emphasized precision over raw power, creating a partnership that complemented rather than copied his father's approach. The challenges to royal authority during Aenys's reign created situations that tested the limits of dragon power in ways the conquest had never demanded. When the Faith Militant seized control of religious sites across the realm and began arming their followers for open rebellion, the king faced a dilemma that force alone could not resolve. Burning temples and killing septons would create martyrs and potentially turn the entire realm against Targaryen rule, yet allowing the rebellion to continue would undermine royal authority and invite further challenges. Balerion's role during these conflicts remained largely ceremonial, as King Aenys sought to resolve disputes through negotiation rather than intimidation. The great dragon made occasional appearances above King's Landing, his shadow serving as a reminder of the power that backed royal authority. But he never unleashed his flames against Westerosi subjects. This restraint, while admirable in its mercy, emboldened those who opposed the crown to believe that the dragons might not be used against them. The death of King Aenys in 42 AC created a succession crisis that would transform the political role of dragons from symbols of unified authority into weapons of civil war. Prince Aegon the Uncrowned held the stronger legal claim to the throne, supported by precedent and the backing of several great houses. However, his uncle Maegor had different ideas about succession, and more importantly, he possessed something his nephew lacked: the willingness to use dragon power without restraint or moral limitation. Maegor Targaryen had spent years on Dragonstone after his exile during his brother's reign, and during this period he had formed a bond with Balerion that differed significantly from the dragon's relationship with Aegon the Conqueror. Where the first Targaryen king had used Balerion's power judiciously, always with clear political objectives, Maegor approached dragon mastery as an expression of personal dominance. He viewed the great dragon not as a partner, but as an instrument of his will, a weapon to be deployed against any who dared question his authority. When Maegor returned from exile to claim the Iron Throne, his arrival on Balerion's back sent a clear message to all who witnessed it. The Black Dread's roar echoed across King's Landing as he landed in the courtyard of the Red Keep, his massive form dwarfing the castle's towers, while his eyes burned with anticipation of violence. The dragon's bond with this new rider reflected a darker aspect of his nature, one that had been restrained during Aegon's reign but now found expression through Maegor's cruel ambitions. The confrontation between uncle and nephew reached its climax above the God's Eye, where Prince Aegon, the Uncrowned, challenged Maegor's usurpation in single combat between dragons. This aerial duel represented more than a struggle for the throne. It embodied the fundamental question of how dragon power should be used in the governance of Westeros. Would dragons serve justice and mercy as they had under the Conqueror, or would they become instruments of tyranny and oppression? The battle itself proved tragically brief as Quicksilver, despite her speed and agility, found herself hopelessly outmatched against Balerion's overwhelming size and power. The Black Dread's experience in dozens of battles, combined with his natural advantages, made the outcome inevitable from the moment the two dragons engaged. Quicksilver fought valiantly, using her superior maneuverability to avoid Balerion's initial attacks. But the older dragon's reach and endurance eventually told. In moments that would be remembered as among the darkest in Targaryen history, Balerion's flames consumed both Quicksilver and Prince Aegon, ending the young prince's claim along with his life. Maegor's victory established him as king but marked the beginning of a reign characterized by unprecedented brutality. Under his rule, Balerion became an instrument of systematic oppression, his flames used to eliminate not just rebels, but anyone who questioned royal authority. The faith militant found themselves targets of methodical extermination as Maegor ordered the burning of their strongholds and the execution of their leaders. The Sept of Remembrance, one of the most sacred sites in the Seven Kingdoms, burned for 3 days when Balerion's fire ignited its wooden structures. The psychological transformation of Balerion under Maegor's influence troubled those who had known the dragon during Aegon's reign. Where once the Black Dread had seemed almost regal in his bearing, now he displayed a restlessness that bordered on bloodlust. His roars carried a different quality, more aggressive and challenging than the confident expressions of power they had been before. Some observers suggested that the dragon had absorbed something of Maegor's cruel nature, though others argued that Balerion was simply responding to his rider's expectations and commands. During this period, Vhagar served Prince Daemon Targaryen, Maegor's nephew, though her role remained largely defensive rather than aggressive. The Bronze Dragon maintained the dignified bearing that had characterized her service during the conquest, but her reluctance to participate in attacks against Westerosi subjects suggested an intelligence that recognized the moral complexities of civil conflict. When Prince Daemon died in suspicious circumstances, Vhagar returned to Dragonstone, where she waited for a new rider worthy of her partnership. The reign of Maegor the Cruel demonstrated both the potential and the dangers of unrestricted dragon power. His systematic use of Balerion to eliminate opposition achieved short-term political objectives while creating long-term problems that would plague the Targaryen dynasty for generations. The fear that had once inspired respect and submission now bred hatred and resentment among the noble houses who had suffered under his tyranny. Common people, who had initially welcomed dragon rule as an alternative to endless warfare between kingdoms, began to whisper of the need for protection against their supposed protectors. Balerion's final years under Maegor revealed disturbing changes in the great dragon's behavior and appearance. Witnesses noted that his flames had grown even hotter, capable of melting stone so thoroughly that entire structures simply vanished in clouds of superheated vapor. His appetite increased dramatically as well, requiring ever larger amounts of prey to maintain his energy levels. Most troubling of all were reports that the Black Dread had begun hunting independently, taking livestock, and occasionally threatening human settlements without his riders' direct command. The death of Maegor the Cruel in 48 AC ended one of the darkest chapters in early Targaryen history and began Balerion's transition to serving yet another king. Prince Jaehaerys, who inherited the throne as a young man, brought a different philosophy to dragon mastery that emphasized restraint and wisdom over displays of raw power. Under his guidance, Balerion gradually returned to the more measured role he had played during the Conqueror's reign. Though the great dragon never fully lost the edge of dangerousness that had characterized his service to Maegor. The early Targaryen kings and their dragons had established the fundamental dynamic that would define the dynasty's relationship with Westeros for centuries to come. They had proven that dragon power could unite kingdoms and maintain peace, but they had also demonstrated the terrible consequences when such power was used without wisdom or restraint. The lessons learned during these formative decades would influence every subsequent Targaryen ruler, shaping their understanding of both the potential and the responsibilities that came with commanding creatures capable of reshaping the very landscape through fire and fury. The ascension of King Jaehaerys Targaryen to the Iron Throne in 48 AC marked the beginning of what historians would remember as the most prosperous and peaceful era in Westerosi history. Unlike his predecessors who had used dragons primarily as weapons of war and intimidation, Jaehaerys approached dragon mastery as a tool of governance and diplomacy. His reign would span more than 5 decades, during which time the relationship between dragons and the realm they protected evolved from one based on fear into something approaching genuine partnership between ruler and subject. Jaehaerys inherited a kingdom scarred by his uncle Maegor's cruelties, where great houses nursed grievances and common people whispered fearfully whenever dragons appeared overhead. The new king understood that healing these wounds required more than royal proclamations or generous policies. The dragons themselves needed to be seen as protectors rather than threats, their presence associated with justice and prosperity rather than arbitrary destruction. This transformation would require patience, wisdom, and a fundamental reimagining of how dragon power could serve the realm. The first step in this process involved the construction of the Dragon Pit in King's Landing, a massive amphitheater designed to house dragons within the city, while demonstrating the Crown's commitment to containing their power. Unlike the cramped quarters that had previously housed visiting dragons, the pit provided space for creatures to live comfortably while remaining accessible to their riders and the specialized keepers who tended to their needs. The structure's design incorporated both practical considerations and symbolic elements, its great dome visible from every quarter of the city, while its underground chambers provided secure housing for even the largest dragons. Balerion, now in his twilight years but still magnificent beyond measure, became the first resident of this new facility. The Black Dread's presence in the heart of King's Landing served multiple purposes, demonstrating the Crown's confidence in its ability to control dragon power while providing citizens with opportunities to witness these legendary creatures in safety. Daily viewings allowed common people to observe Balerion at rest, marveling at his enormous size while losing some of their instinctive fear through gradual familiarity. The establishment of the Dragonkeeper Order represented another innovation of Jaehaerys' reign, creating a professional class of men trained specifically in dragon care and handling. These keepers, selected for their courage and intelligence rather than noble birth, learned to approach dragons with the proper mixture of respect and confidence required to manage creatures whose intelligence matched their power. Under their care, dragons received consistent feeding schedules, medical attention when needed, and the social interaction that their complex minds required for emotional well-being. King Jaehaerys himself formed a partnership with Vermithor, a bronze dragon who had hatched during the early years after the conquest. Vermithor displayed characteristics that perfectly matched his rider's temperament, showing remarkable intelligence and a calm demeanor that made him ideal for the diplomatic missions that characterized Jaehaerys' approach to governance. The Bronze Fury, as he came to be known, grew steadily throughout the king's reign until he rivaled even Balerion in size, though he never achieved the Black Dread's legendary proportions or fearsome reputation. The bond between Jaehaerys and Vermithor represented the evolution of dragon mastery from conquest tool to governance partner. Their flights across the realm served diplomatic rather than military purposes, carrying the king to meetings with regional lords and allowing him to address concerns before they escalated into rebellions. Vermithor's presence at these gatherings reminded everyone of royal authority, while his calm behavior demonstrated that dragon power could be exercised with restraint and wisdom. Queen Alysanne Targaryen established an equally significant partnership with Silverwing, a dragon whose gentle temperament and beautiful silver scales made her beloved throughout the realm. Unlike the fierce war dragons that had conquered Westeros, Silverwing seemed naturally inclined toward peaceful pursuits, delighting in long flights over countryside and showing particular fondness for areas where people gathered in celebration. The Queen's dragon became known for her tolerance of crowds and her willingness to land in populated areas without causing panic among the inhabitants. The partnership between Queen Alysanne and Silverwing enabled some of the most remarkable journeys in Targaryen history, including their famous progress to the north, where they became the first dragon and rider to visit Winterfell since the conquest. The Queen's diplomatic missions strengthened bonds between the Iron Throne and its most distant subjects, while Silverwing's presence reminded everyone of the power that protected the realm's peace. Their flights took them from the Summer Isles to the lands beyond the Wall, though certain mysterious limitations prevented even dragons from crossing certain boundaries. One of the most intriguing episodes of Alysanne's travels occurred during her visit to the Night's Watch at Castle Black. Silverwing had carried her queen north of the Wall on previous occasions without difficulty. But during this particular journey, the dragon suddenly refused to fly further north, landing abruptly and showing signs of distress that her rider had never witnessed before. Despite Alysanne's encouragement and even direct commands, Silverwing would not continue beyond a certain point, her behavior suggesting an awareness of dangers that human senses could not detect. This mysterious incident highlighted the fact that dragons possessed knowledge and instincts that their riders did not fully understand. Silverwing's refusal to proceed suggested that the creatures retained connections to magical forces that transcended their partnerships with human riders. The event became the subject of considerable speculation among maesters and dragon keepers. Though no satisfactory explanation emerged for the dragon's unusual behavior during what should have been a routine flight, the reign of Jaehaerys also witnessed the hatching and development of new dragons, including several that would play crucial roles in future Targaryen history. Caraxes, who would later become known as the Bloodworm, hatched during these peaceful years and quickly distinguished himself through his unusual appearance and temperament. Unlike the more conventional dragon breeds, Caraxes possessed an elongated neck and serpentine build that gave him an almost snake-like appearance. His red scales and aggressive personality earned him early recognition as a formidable creature, despite his unconventional proportions. Prince Aemon Targaryen, Jaehaerys' eldest son and heir, formed the first partnership with Caraxes during the dragon's youth. Their bond demonstrated the continuing strength of Targaryen dragon mastery, while showcasing the unique characteristics that distinguished each dragon rider relationship. Prince Aemon's gentle nature seemed to balance Caraxes' natural aggressiveness, creating a partnership that combined martial prowess with diplomatic wisdom. The prince used his dragon for both ceremonial functions and practical governance, establishing a model that future Targaryen heirs would follow. The Dragon Pit became a center of learning during this period, as masters and keepers worked together to understand dragon biology, behavior, and the magical forces that sustained these creatures. They documented feeding requirements, mating behaviors, and the complex social hierarchies that dragons established among themselves. This accumulated knowledge proved invaluable for managing multiple dragons in close proximity while ensuring their health and emotional well-being. The peaceful decades of Jaehaerys' reign allowed dragons to develop in ways that conquest and civil war had never permitted. Without the constant stress of battle, they displayed more complex behaviors and deeper emotional bonds with their riders and keepers. Balerion, despite his fearsome reputation, showed surprising gentleness when interacting with young dragons, teaching them hunting techniques and social behaviors through patient demonstration rather than aggressive dominance. The establishment of formal protocols for dragon care during this period created traditions that would influence Targaryen dragon mastery for generations. Keepers learned to read the subtle signs that indicated a dragon's mood and health, understanding when creatures needed solitude and when they craved social interaction. They developed specialized equipment for dragon maintenance, including tools for scale cleaning and claw trimming that allowed proper care without risking injury to either dragon or keeper. As Jaehaerys's reign progressed into its later decades, the king and his dragons aged together, their partnership deepening through shared experiences across the realm. Vermithor had grown enormous by this time, his bronze scales gleaming with health and his intelligence evident in the way he anticipated his riders' needs during their flights. The dragon had learned to recognize the castles and cities they visited regularly, often adjusting his approach based on local conditions and the preferences of people they encountered. The death of Balerion in 94 AC marked the end of an era in more ways than one. The Black Dread had lived for nearly 2 centuries, serving 4 different kings and participating in every major event of early Targaryen history. His passing represented the last direct link to the ancient dragons of Valyria, creatures who had witnessed the freehold at its height and survived its destruction. The skull that was later mounted in the Red Keep's throne room served as a monument to both his individual greatness and the era he represented. With Balerion's death, Vermithor inherited the position of largest living dragon, though he would never match the Black Dread's legendary reputation or historical significance. The Bronze Fury's more peaceful nature suited the continuing prosperity of Jaehaerys's reign, his flights over the realm serving as reminders of royal protection rather than threats of royal vengeance. The transition represented the completion of dragon power's evolution, from conquest weapon to governance tool, a transformation that would define the Targaryen approach to rule, until the civil wars that lay ahead would test these carefully established traditions. The death of King Jaehaerys in 103 AC brought to an end the longest and most peaceful reign in Targaryen history, but it also created succession complications that would ultimately tear the dynasty apart. His chosen heir, Prince Viserys, inherited not just the Iron Throne, but a realm that had grown accustomed to stability and prosperity under dragon protection. The new king's dragons reflected both the promise and the perils that awaited his reign, creatures whose bonds with their riders would be tested by political pressures that the old king had successfully avoided through decades of careful diplomacy. King Viserys Targaryen rode Balerion's successor in both size and temperament, though no dragon would ever truly replace the Black Dread in the realm's imagination. The king preferred gentle dragons that matched his peaceful disposition, avoiding the more aggressive creatures that might have better suited a warrior king. His approach to dragon mastery reflected his broader philosophy of governance, emphasizing stability and continuity over the dramatic displays of power that had characterized earlier reigns. This preference for harmony over conflict would prove both his greatest strength and ultimate weakness. Princess Rhaenyra Targaryen, the king's daughter and chosen heir, formed her partnership with dragons at an unusually early age when she bonded with Syrax while still a child. This golden dragon, named after a goddess of old Valyria, possessed scales that gleamed like polished metal and eyes that burned with intelligence and pride. The early formation of this bond created an unusually strong connection between rider and dragon, one that would define both their personalities as they matured together through the challenges that lay ahead. Syrax displayed characteristics that perfectly complemented her young rider's spirited nature. The golden dragon possessed a confidence that bordered on arrogance, circling above King's Landing with the assured grace of a creature who knew herself to be magnificent. Her flights with Princess Rhaenyra became legendary throughout the realm as spectators gathered to witness the sight of the young princess soaring above the Red Keep on her gleaming mount. These public displays served to reinforce Rhaenyra's position as heir, while demonstrating the continuing strength of Targaryen dragon mastery. The relationship between Syrax and Rhaenyra evolved as both matured, developing into a partnership that reflected the princess's growing political awareness and personal ambitions. The dragon seemed to sense her rider's moods and aspirations, becoming more protective during times of political tension and more playful when Rhaenyra sought escape from courtly pressures. Their bond represented something deeper than simple mastery, approaching the legendary partnerships that had characterized the greatest dragon riders of Valyrian history. Prince Daemon Targaryen, the king's younger brother, established a very different relationship with his dragon Caraxes, a creature whose appearance and temperament set him apart from all other dragons in Targaryen history. Known as the Bloodworm for his distinctive red coloring and serpentine build, Caraxes possessed an elongated neck and lean body that gave him an almost snake-like appearance when compared to more traditionally proportioned dragons. His unusual anatomy, rather than representing weakness, actually enhanced his maneuverability and speed, making him one of the most formidable dragons in combat despite his unconventional design. The partnership between Daemon and Caraxes reflected the prince's own complex nature, combining fierce loyalty with an independence that sometimes bordered on rebellion. Caraxes displayed an aggressive temperament that required careful handling, though his intelligence and emotional depth created strong bonds with those who earned his respect. The dragon's fierce loyalty to Daemon became legendary, with witnesses noting that Caraxes seemed to anticipate his rider's needs and moods with an almost supernatural awareness. During this period, the Velaryon family's close ties to House Targaryen resulted in their own dragon partnerships, when Laenor Velaryon bonded with Sea Smoke, a dragon distinguished by his silver-gray scales and exceptional speed. Sea Smoke's lean build and agile flight patterns made him ideal for reconnaissance missions and rapid message delivery, roles that proved invaluable as political tensions began to develop across the realm. The dragon's bond with Laenor created the first non-Targaryen dragon rider since the conquest, expanding the pool of available dragon power while raising questions about the exclusivity of dragon mastery. The War for the Stepstones provided the first test of this new generation of dragons in actual combat, as Daemon Targaryen and Caraxes fought alongside Sea Smoke and Laenor Velaryon against the pirate fleets that threatened shipping lanes in the Narrow Sea. These conflicts, while smaller in scale than the great battles of conquest, demonstrated that dragons retained their devastating effectiveness in warfare. Caraxes proved particularly suited to naval combat, his agility allowing him to strike at ships with precision while avoiding the ballistae that pirates used in desperate attempts to bring down their tormentors. The success of dragon power in the Stepstones reinforced the Targaryen monopoly on military dominance, while providing valuable combat experience for riders who had known only peaceful applications of their skills. Prince Daemon's victories enhanced his reputation as a warrior and commander, though they also increased tensions between him and his brother, the king. The prince's independent actions and growing power base created concerns about divided loyalties that would plague the royal family for years to come. As King Viserys' reign progressed, the question of succession began to dominate court politics in ways that directly affected dragon partnerships. The king's marriage to Queen Alicent Hightower produced male heirs whose claims potentially superseded those of Princess Rhaenyra, creating factions that formed around competing interpretations of succession law. These political divisions extended to the dragons themselves, as different creatures bonded with riders from opposing camps. Prince Aegon Targaryen, the king's eldest son by Queen Alicent, formed his partnership with Sunfire, a dragon whose golden scales and majestic appearance earned him the epithet, the Golden. Sunfire displayed characteristics that reflected both his rider's royal heritage and the growing tensions within the family, showing particular sensitivity to political atmospheres and displaying protective instincts that sometimes manifested as aggression toward perceived threats to his rider's position. The most dramatic shift in dragon partnerships occurred when Prince Aemon Targaryen, Queen Alicent's younger son, claimed Vhagar after the death of Lady Laena Velaryon. This event transformed the political balance within the royal family as Aemon, previously the only prince without a dragon, suddenly found himself bonded to the largest and most fearsome creature in the world. Vhagar's acceptance of this young rider demonstrated the unpredictable nature of dragon bonding while creating a partnership that would have profound consequences for the realm's future. The claiming of Vhagar by Prince Aemon created immediate tensions that went beyond simple family rivalry. The enormous bronze dragon had been without a rider since Laena's death, and many had assumed she would eventually bond with one of Laena's daughters. Aemon's successful claim represented a bold assertion of his worthiness as a dragon rider, while simultaneously depriving the opposing faction of access to the realm's most powerful dragon. The political implications were immediately apparent to everyone involved, though none could predict how dramatically this partnership would affect future events. The growing division between the factions that supported Princess Rhaenyra and those who favored Queen Alicent's children became reflected in the dragons themselves. Syrax grew increasingly protective of her rider as political tensions mounted, while Sunfire displayed similar loyalty to Prince Aegon. These behavioral changes suggested that dragons possessed an awareness of political undercurrents that went beyond simple response to their rider's emotions, implying a deeper understanding of human conflicts than previously recognized. The final years of King Viserys's reign saw the establishment of dragon partnerships that would define the coming civil war. Each major faction possessed formidable dragon power, creating a balance that made peaceful resolution increasingly unlikely, while raising the stakes of any potential conflict to catastrophic levels. The dragons that had once united the Seven Kingdoms under Targaryen rule now found themselves potentially facing each other in battles that would test loyalties and bonds forged over generations of shared service. The stage was set for a confrontation that would pit dragon against dragon, brother against sister, and the very foundations of Targaryen rule against the ambitions of those who sought to reshape it according to their own vision. The peaceful reign of King Jaehaerys had proven that dragons could serve as instruments of governance and diplomacy, but the political pressures building within the royal family would soon test whether these creatures could maintain their legendary bonds when forced to choose between competing masters who shared the same blood and the same claim to walls. Their loyalty. The death of King Viserys Targaryen in 129 AC shattered the carefully maintained peace that had characterized the realm for decades, unleashing forces that would transform the political landscape of Westeros and forever alter the relationship between dragons and their human partners. Within hours of the king's passing, two competing factions moved to claim the Iron Throne, each believing themselves the rightful heirs to Targaryen power. The speed with which these rivals acted revealed the depth of planning that had preceded this moment. Years of careful preparation that now exploded into open conflict with devastating consequences for the realm and its dragons. On Dragonstone, Princess Rhaenyra received word of her father's death while still believing herself to be his acknowledged heir. The black crown of Aegon the Conqueror was placed upon her head in a ceremony witnessed by her supporters and blessed by the presence of Syrax, whose golden scales caught the volcanic light of the island's forges. The dragon's behavior during this coronation revealed an awareness of the moment's significance, her proud bearing and protective posture, suggesting an understanding that her rider's elevation to queen meant changes that would affect them both profoundly. Meanwhile, in King's Landing, Queen Alicent Hightower and her supporters moved with equal speed to crown her son Aegon as the rightful king. Prince Aegon, reluctant though he initially proved to be, found himself thrust into a position he had never truly sought, while his dragon Sunfire the Golden became a symbol of his faction's legitimacy. The magnificent creature's presence during the coronation ceremony provided visual confirmation of the new king's dragon heritage, while his calm acceptance of the crowds demonstrated the training and temperament that would serve them both in the trials ahead. The realm now faced an unprecedented situation as two monarchs claimed the same throne, each backed by dragon power that made compromise increasingly unlikely. The great houses began choosing sides based on a complex mixture of legal precedent, political advantage, and personal loyalty, while the dragons themselves prepared for conflicts that would test bonds and loyalties forged over generations of peaceful service. The creatures that had once united seven kingdoms now found themselves preparing to face each other in battles that would determine the future of the dynasty they had helped establish. Prince Lucerys Velaryon, son of Princess Rhaenyra, found himself thrust into diplomatic service despite his youth when his mother dispatched him to Storm's End aboard his dragon Arax. The young prince's mission seemed straightforward: secure the loyalty of House Baratheon by reminding Lord Boros of his oath to support Rhaenyra's claim. Arax, a young dragon barely past adolescence, had formed a strong bond with Luke despite their relative inexperience in both flying and politics. The dragon's small size and gentle nature made him ideal for diplomatic missions, his presence impressive enough to command respect while remaining non-threatening enough to facilitate negotiation. The flight to Storm's End proved routine, until Lucerys discovered that Prince Aemon Targaryen had arrived before him, his massive dragon Vhagar already resting in the castle's courtyard like a bronze mountain. The sight of the enormous dragon, largest in the world following Balerion's death, immediately transformed the diplomatic mission into something far more dangerous. Vhagar's presence served as both a reminder of the Green's military power and a direct challenge to any who would oppose their claim to the throne. The confrontation between the two princes within Storm's End revealed the personal animosities that underlay the broader political conflict. Prince Aemon's loss of his eye during a childhood fight with Lucerys had created a grudge that years had failed to diminish, while Luke's participation in that earlier conflict made him a symbol of everything Aemon resented about his half-sister's supporters. Lord Boros Baratheon, caught between competing claims and conflicting loyalties, chose to remain neutral while allowing both princes to depart unharmed, though his decision could not prevent the tragedy that followed. As Prince Lucerys prepared to leave Storm's End, he found Arrax growing increasingly agitated in Vhagar's presence. The young dragon sensed the hostility radiating from the enormous bronze beast, whose scarred hide and battle-hardened demeanor spoke of decades spent in service to warriors and conquerors. Despite Luke's attempts to calm his mount, Arrax displayed clear signs of distress, his usual confidence shaken by proximity to a creature whose size and power dwarfed his own developing abilities. The departure from Storm's End quickly became a pursuit as Prince Aemon, unable to contain his desire for revenge, commanded Vhagar to follow the fleeing pair. What began as intimidation escalated beyond either rider's control when the dragons themselves began responding to instincts older and deeper than their partnerships with humans. Arrax, terrified by the massive predator pursuing him through storm clouds above Shipbreaker Bay, released a gout of flame toward Vhagar in a desperate attempt to ward off his pursuer. The young dragon's attack struck Vhagar across the snout, causing pain but no serious injury to the bronze giant. However, the assault triggered responses that transcended the commands of human riders as Vhagar's predatory instincts overwhelmed her training and discipline. Despite Prince Aemon's attempts to regain control, the enormous dragon lunged forward with jaws that could crush stone, catching Arrax in a grip that ended both the young dragon's life and that of his rider in moments that changed the course of history. The death of Prince Lucerys Velaryon and his dragon Arrax above Shipbreaker Bay transformed a political dispute into a blood feud that would consume the Targaryen dynasty. The loss of Rhaenyra's son created a personal grievance that transcended mere succession politics, while the manner of his death demonstrated that dragon partnerships carried risks that even experienced riders could not always control. The incident revealed that these intelligent creatures retained instincts and responses that could override human command, particularly when faced with threats or challenges that triggered their most primitive drives. Princess Rhaenyra's grief at learning of her son's death manifested in ways that affected both her judgment and her relationship with Syrax. The golden dragon seemed to absorb her rider's pain and rage, becoming more aggressive and protective than ever before. Their flights together took on a different quality as Syrax circled Dragonstone with the restless energy of a creature preparing for war, her usual graceful movements replaced by the sharp turns and sudden dives of a predator seeking targets for her frustration. The response from King Aegon II and his supporters revealed the complex web of loyalties and interests that now divided the realm. While Prince Aemon expressed regret for the loss of control that had led to his nephew's death, the Green faction could not afford to appear weak by offering substantial concessions to their rivals. The incident had crossed a line that made peaceful resolution increasingly unlikely, forcing both sides to prepare for a conflict that would test every dragon partnership in ways that centuries of peace had never demanded. Queen Alicent's attempts to prevent escalation foundered against the momentum of events that had moved beyond diplomatic control. The death of Luke Velaryon had created a cycle of vengeance that would demand satisfaction from both sides, while the dragons themselves seemed to sense the approaching conflict. Reports from King's Landing described unusual behavior among the creatures housed in the dragon pit, increased restlessness and aggression that their keepers struggled to manage despite years of experience with dragon care. The symbolic importance of dragon partnerships became increasingly apparent as both factions prepared for war. Each creature represented not just military power but legitimacy and divine favor, their willingness to serve particular riders interpreted as validation of competing claims to the throne. The dragons that had once symbolized Targaryen unity now embodied the divisions that threatened to destroy the dynasty from within, their relationships with human partners becoming markers of political loyalty rather than simple bonds of affection and service. As winter deepened and ravens carried news of gathering armies across the realm, the dragons of House Targaryen prepared for conflicts that would test every aspect of their nature. The creatures that had conquered 7 kingdoms through coordinated action now faced the prospect of fighting each other in battles that would determine not just political supremacy, but the very survival of dragon power in Westeros. The bonds that had been forged in peace would soon be tested in fire, and the results would echo through the remainder of Targaryen history. The stage was set for Princess Rhaenys Targaryen and her dragon Meleys to make their fateful choice when summoned to Rook's Rest by reports of enemy activity. The Red Queen, as Meleys was known for her scarlet scales and fierce temperament, had served the princess faithfully for decades, their partnership representing one of the strongest bonds in recent Targaryen history. Princess Rhaenys, called the Queen Who Never Was for her unsuccessful claim to the throne in an earlier succession dispute, brought both experience and bitter understanding of political realities to her role in the current conflict. The trap that awaited them at Rook's Rest had been carefully orchestrated by the Green faction, who understood that eliminating experienced dragon riders was as important as controlling territory or commanding armies. Prince Aemond and Vhagar had positioned themselves to coordinate with King Aegon and Sunfire, creating overwhelming odds that would test Meleys' legendary speed and Princess Rhaenys' tactical skills. The plan represented the kind of calculated ruthlessness that would characterize the entire civil war, prioritizing effectiveness over honor and victory over family bonds. The battle that erupted above Rook's Rest became the first true test of dragon against dragon since the conquest, revealing both the devastating potential and tragic consequences of civil war fought with such overwhelming weapons. Meleys fought with the courage and skill that had made her legendary. But even her considerable abilities could not overcome the coordinated assault of 2 dragons working in perfect synchronization. The Red Queen's death marked more than the loss of a single dragon. It represented the beginning of systematic destruction that would ultimately consume the very creatures that had made Targaryen rule possible. The devastating losses suffered by both factions during the early battles of the Dance of Dragons forced Princess Rhaenyra to confront a harsh reality that threatened the very foundation of her claim to power. The death of Princess Rhaenys and her dragon Meleys at Rook's Rest had eliminated one of her most experienced dragon riders, while the continuing loyalty of other great houses remained uncertain in the face of mounting green victories. Most critically, her faction possessed fewer dragons than their rivals, a disadvantage that could prove decisive in a conflict where aerial supremacy determined the outcome of battles and the fate of kingdoms. The solution to this crisis lay in an unprecedented experiment that challenged centuries of Targaryen tradition regarding dragon mastery. Since the conquest, dragons had bonded exclusively with members of the royal family, their partnerships limited to those who carried the blood of old Valyria in their veins. However, the desperate circumstances of civil war forced Rhaenyra to consider expanding this exclusive circle to include distant relatives, acknowledged bastards, and others who might possess sufficient Targaryen heritage to form bonds with the riderless dragons that waited on Dragonstone. The dragons available for this dangerous experiment represented some of the most powerful creatures in the world, their lack of riders resulting from the deaths of previous partners rather than any deficiency in their abilities or temperament. Vermithor, the Bronze Fury, who had served King Jaehaerys faithfully for decades, remained the largest dragon alive following Balerion's death. His enormous size and battle experience made him potentially the most valuable asset in Rhaenyra's arsenal, though his fierce independence and particular requirements in a rider made him equally dangerous to approach without proper preparation. Silverwing, Queen Alysanne's former mount, presented different challenges and opportunities for potential riders. Her gentle temperament and long history of peaceful service suggested she might prove more receptive to new partnerships, though her intelligence and emotional depth meant she would judge potential riders according to standards that humans could not fully understand. The Silver Dragon's grief for her deceased rider remained apparent years after Queen Alysanne's death, manifesting in behaviors that suggested dragons experienced loss and mourning in ways that paralleled human emotional responses. The most mysterious of the available dragons was Sheepstealer, a wild creature who had never bonded with human riders but whose intelligence and power were undeniable. This brown-scaled dragon had earned his name through his habit of stealing livestock from the surrounding islands, displaying the independence and self-sufficiency that characterized dragons who lived without human partnership. His wild nature made him potentially the most dangerous to approach, though it also suggested that successful bonding might create an unusually strong partnership between rider and mount. The search for suitable candidates to attempt these bondings led Rhaenyra's agents across the Seven Kingdoms, as they sought individuals who possessed the blood of dragons in their ancestry. Some candidates emerged from noble houses whose lineages included Targaryen marriages from previous generations, while others represented the acknowledged bastards of Targaryen princes, whose illegitimate birth had prevented them from claiming dragons during peacetime. The most promising candidates often came from the humblest origins, their dragon heritage revealed only through careful genealogical research and the testimony of those who remembered ancient bloodlines. Adam of Hull emerged as one of the most successful dragon seeds when he approached Seasmoke, the gray dragon who had served Laenor Velaryon until that prince's mysterious disappearance. The dragon's acceptance of this new rider created immediate speculation about the true nature of dragon bonding and the role that bloodline played in determining compatibility. Seasmoke's willingness to serve Adam suggested either that his previous rider had indeed died, or that dragons could form multiple partnerships under extraordinary circumstances. The bonding between Adam and Seasmoke demonstrated the complex emotional intelligence that characterized dragon relationships with their human partners. Seasmoke showed initial reluctance when approached by potential riders, his behavior suggesting grief for his missing partner and uncertainty about forming new attachments. However, something in Adam's demeanor, or perhaps his hidden Targaryen heritage, convinced the dragon to accept this new partnership, creating a bond that would prove crucial in the battles ahead. Hugh Hammer's attempt to claim Vermithor, the Bronze Fury, represented perhaps the most dangerous of all the dragonseed experiments. The enormous dragon's size and temperament made him a prize worth any risk, but his particular requirements in a rider had left him without a partner for years following King Jaehaerys' death. Hugh, a blacksmith whose Targaryen ancestry remained uncertain, approached the great dragon with a combination of courage and desperation that characterized all the dragonseed candidates. The confrontation between Hugh and Vermithor in the caverns beneath Dragonstone created one of the most dramatic moments in the entire dragonseed experiment. The Bronze Fury's initial hostility toward this presumptuous human nearly resulted in Hugh's immediate death, the dragon's roar alone sufficient to collapse portions of the cave around them. However, something in the blacksmith's refusal to flee or show submission impressed the ancient creature, leading to a grudging acceptance that gradually developed into a working partnership. Ulf the White's claiming of Silverwing proved less dramatic, but equally significant for Rhaenyra's military prospects. The former fool and drunkard approached Queen Alysanne's dragon with irreverence that should have resulted in his incineration. Yet Silverwing detected something in his bloodline that convinced her to accept his partnership. Their bond, while never achieving the depth of connection that had characterized the dragon's relationship with the Good Queen, proved functional enough for military purposes. The most unusual and perhaps most significant of all the dragonseed partnerships involved Nettles, a young woman of uncertain origin who succeeded in bonding with Sheepstealer through methods that defied conventional understanding. Rather than attempting to dominate or command the wild dragon, Nettles approached him with offerings of food and patience that gradually earned his trust and acceptance. Their partnership challenged fundamental assumptions about dragon mastery, while creating one of the strongest bonds between rider and mount in Targaryen history. The process of claiming dragons proved deadly for many candidates whose courage exceeded their compatibility with the creatures they approached. The caverns beneath Dragonstone bore witness to numerous tragedies, as would-be riders found themselves facing creatures whose judgment proved harsh and final. Some died in flames while others fell victim to claws and fangs, their deaths serving as grim reminders of the risks inherent in approaching animals capable of destroying armies with their breath alone. The successful dragon seed partnerships transformed the military balance of the Civil War, while creating new complications that neither faction had fully anticipated. These new riders brought different perspectives and loyalties to their roles, their humble origins and uncertain bloodlines, making them wild cards in a conflict that had previously been fought exclusively by established nobility. Their presence challenged traditional hierarchies while introducing elements of unpredictability that would influence the course of battles in ways that conventional military planning could not account for. The dragons themselves seemed to recognize the significance of these new partnerships, displaying behaviors that suggested awareness of the changed circumstances surrounding their service. Veterans like Vermithor and Silverwing adapted to their new riders' different styles and capabilities, while creatures like Sheepstealer revealed aspects of their nature that had remained hidden during their years of independence. These evolving relationships demonstrated the remarkable adaptability that characterized dragon intelligence, while highlighting the emotional complexity of creatures often dismissed as mere weapons. The introduction of dragon seed riders also revealed the degree to which dragon loyalty was personal rather than political, their bonds with individual humans transcending the broader conflicts that divided the realm. This discovery had profound implications for the Civil War, as it suggested that dragons might not automatically transfer their allegiance based on political considerations alone. Instead, they judged their riders according to criteria that humans could not fully comprehend, creating partnerships based on compatibility rather than convenience or strategic necessity. The war that had begun with political maneuvering and personal grievances escalated into systematic devastation as both factions committed their dragon riders to increasingly desperate strategies. The Battle of the Gullet demonstrated the tactical evolution that characterized this new form of warfare, when Seasmoke and his rider Adam of Hull proved their worth in naval combat against the Triarchy fleet. The silver-gray dragon's agility and speed made him ideally suited to attacking ships whose crews had no experience fighting aerial opponents, while Adam's humble origins and natural courage created a partnership that achieved victories through skill rather than overwhelming force. The success at the Gullet showcased how the Dragonseed riders had adapted to their new roles with remarkable effectiveness. Seasmoke's attacks on enemy vessels revealed tactical innovations that veteran dragon riders had never considered, using the dragon's ability to dive beneath the waves to approach targets from unexpected angles. Adam's background as a sailor informed his understanding of naval warfare, allowing him to exploit weaknesses in enemy formations that purely land-based commanders might have missed. Meanwhile, Prince Daemon Targaryen and his dragon Caraxes prepared for what would become their final mission, a journey to Harrenhal that carried implications far beyond simple military objectives. The Bloodworm had grown increasingly restless as the war progressed, his serpentine form coiled with tension that reflected his riders' growing frustration with the pace of conflict. Their partnership, always characterized by intensity and mutual understanding, now carried an edge of desperation that would drive them toward a confrontation that neither would survive. The mysterious circumstances surrounding Daemon's activities at Harrenhal created speculation that persisted long after the war's end. Witnesses reported seeing Caraxes circling the ruined towers at unusual hours, his distinctive silhouette cutting through mist and shadow as he performed maneuvers that served no apparent tactical purpose. Some claimed the dragon was responding to magical influences that permeated the cursed castle, while others suggested that both rider and mount were preparing for a mission that required absolute coordination between their abilities. The appearance of Prince Aemond and Vhagar above the God's Eye transformed what might have been a strategic retreat into the most significant dragon battle in Targaryen history. The enormous bronze dragon's arrival over the lake created a confrontation that had been building since the war began, pitting the largest dragon in the world against one of the most experienced and aggressive. Both riders understood that this battle would determine more than tactical advantage. It would establish which faction possessed the superior dragon power and which philosophy of governance would prevail. The aerial combat above the God's Eye revealed the full horror and majesty of dragons unleashed against each other without restraint. Caraxes, despite his smaller size, proved a formidable opponent whose unconventional build and aggressive nature allowed him to match Vhagar's raw power through superior speed and maneuverability. The bloodworm's serpentine neck enabled attacks from angles that more traditionally built dragons could not achieve, while his fierce loyalty to Prince Daemon drove him to fight with an intensity that bordered on suicidal determination. Vhagar's responses during this battle demonstrated the terrible effectiveness of her size and experience, her massive jaws capable of crushing stone serving as weapons that could end the fight in moments if they connected with their target. The bronze dragon's battle roar echoed across the lake like thunder, a sound that spoke of decades spent in service to warriors and conquerors. Her partnership with Prince Aemond had reached a level of coordination that allowed them to anticipate each other's movements while exploiting every advantage their superior size provided. The mutual destruction of both dragons and riders above the God's Eye created a tragedy that exceeded even the most pessimistic predictions about civil war's cost. Caraxes and Vhagar fell together into the lake's depths, their massive forms creating waves that reached the shoreline while their death cries echoed across the water like the voices of dying gods. Prince Daemon and Prince Aemond perished with their mounts, their bodies lost in the depths along with the creatures that had served them so faithfully. This devastating loss eliminated two of the war's most experienced dragon riders, while demonstrating the ultimate futility of conflicts fought with such overwhelming weapons. The death of Vhagar, in particular, represented a catastrophic blow to both factions as her size and power had made her virtually irreplaceable. No remaining dragon could match her capabilities, while the loss of her experience and battle-tested partnership with Prince Aemond left the Green faction significantly weakened despite their other advantages. The news of this mutual destruction reached King's Landing at a time when the city's population had already begun to question the wisdom of a war fought with dragons above their heads. The common people, who had initially supported their respective factions with enthusiasm, now faced the daily reality of creatures whose battles could devastate entire neighborhoods if fought too close to populated areas. The Dragon Pit, once a symbol of royal power and protection, became a source of anxiety as citizens worried about the consequences of housing such dangerous creatures within the city walls. The growing unrest among King's Landing's population reflected broader changes in how ordinary people viewed dragons during this period of civil war. The creatures that had once inspired awe and respect now generated fear and resentment as their battles brought destruction to innocent communities across the realm. Stories spread of villages burned by accident during dragon fights, of crops destroyed by creatures seeking food or shelter, and of families displaced by conflicts they had no part in creating. These tensions reached a breaking point when rumors spread that Queen Rhaenyra intended to use her remaining dragons against the city itself. The prospect of dragonfire falling upon their homes and businesses drove the population to desperation, creating conditions that would soon explode into violence. The dragons housed in the Dragon Pit became symbols of oppression rather than protection, their presence within the city viewed as a constant threat to the lives and livelihoods of everyone who lived beneath their shadow. The storming of the Dragon Pit represented one of the most shocking episodes in the entire history of dragon-human relationships. Common people, armed with little more than determination and makeshift weapons, overwhelmed the dragon keepers and forced their way into the chambers where several dragons waited in captivity. The creatures that had once conquered kingdoms found themselves facing an enemy they could not comprehend. Thousands of humans working together with single-minded purpose to destroy them. The dragons housed in the pit fought desperately to defend themselves, their flames and claws taking a terrible toll on their attackers. But the sheer weight of numbers and the confined space of their prison worked against them. Tyraxes, Shrykos, and Morgul, young dragons whose potential would never be realized, died in agony as common people wielded spears and hammers against creatures they blamed for the destruction of their city. The death of these dragons represented more than military losses. It marked the beginning of a fundamental shift in how the realm viewed the creatures that had once seemed invincible. Princess Rhaenyra's flight from King's Landing aboard Syrax occurred as the city erupted in violence that targeted anything associated with Targaryen rule. The golden dragon's distress at leaving behind the other dragons reflected the emotional bonds that connected these creatures even across factional lines. Syrax's behavior during their escape revealed the psychological trauma that dragons experienced when forced to abandon their companions to violent death. Her flight patterns erratic and her responses to commands delayed by grief and confusion. The final confrontation at Dragonstone between Rhaenyra and her half-brother Aegon II created a bitter conclusion to a war that had consumed almost everything both sides had fought to preserve. Sunfire the Golden, despite his injuries from earlier battles, retained enough strength to serve his rider's desire for vengeance against the woman who had challenged his claim to the throne. The magnificent dragon's participation in Rhaenyra's execution marked the end of her line's resistance, while demonstrating that even the most beautiful dragons could serve the darkest purposes when commanded by riders, consumed with hatred and the desire for revenge. The final years of the Dance of Dragons witnessed the systematic destruction of creatures that had taken centuries to breed and train. Their deaths marking not just military losses, but the collapse of an entire magical tradition. King Aegon II's victory over his half-sister brought him a throne that ruled over a realm devastated by civil war, its great houses impoverished by conflict and its people traumatized by years of dragon battles fought above their heads. The surviving dragons reflected this broader devastation, their numbers reduced to a handful of creatures whose injuries and psychological damage would prevent them from ever fully recovering their former glory. Sunfire the Golden, despite his role in securing final victory for the Green faction, bore wounds that would never fully heal from his battles against other dragons. The magnificent creature's golden scales had been scarred by flame and claw, while his wing membranes showed tears that limited his flying ability and caused him constant pain. Yet the dragon's loyalty to King Aegon II remained absolute, their partnership strengthened rather than weakened by the trials they had endured together. Sunfire's devotion to his rider became legendary among those who witnessed their final years together. The dragon seeming to understand that his king bore psychological wounds as severe as his own physical injuries. The broken king and his damaged dragon ruled over a realm that had lost much of its faith in Targaryen governance. The destruction caused by the Civil War had demonstrated that dragons could be turned against each other, and that their riders were capable of using these creatures to destroy the very foundations of the civilization they were meant to protect. Common people who had once viewed dragons with awe now looked upon them with suspicion and fear, while great houses that had submitted to dragon power began to question whether such submission remained necessary or wise. The few dragons that survived the Civil War displayed behavioral changes that reflected the trauma they had experienced during years of conflict. Those who had witnessed the deaths of their companions showed signs of depression and anxiety that their keepers struggled to address through traditional care methods. Some dragons refused to fly for extended periods, while others became hypervigilant and aggressive toward anyone who approached them without proper authorization. The psychological damage inflicted upon these intelligent creatures paralleled the broader trauma that affected human survivors of the war. Morning, one of the last dragons hatched during the Civil War period, represented both hope and tragedy for the Targaryen dynasty. This young dragon's pale pink scales and gentle temperament suggested the possibility of rebuilding dragon populations through careful breeding. Yet her small size and fragile constitution revealed the genetic problems that were beginning to affect dragon bloodlines. The inbreeding that had preserved dragon traits through generations of careful selection was now producing creatures whose physical defects and shortened lifespans threatened the long-term survival of the species. The death of Sunfire the Golden in 130 AC eliminated the last of the great war dragons, leaving behind only younger creatures whose potential would never be fully realized. The magnificent dragon's passing marked more than the loss of a single animal. It represented the end of an era when dragons had served as partners in governance and conquest. The creatures that remained were shadows of their predecessors, lacking both the size and the temperament that had made previous generations so formidable. King Aegon II's death, shortly after his dragon's passing, created another succession crisis that the weakened dynasty struggled to resolve. The new king, Aegon III, inherited a throne that commanded diminished respect, and dragons that could no longer enforce royal authority through overwhelming force. The surviving creatures, housed in the rebuilt dragon pit under heavy guard, represented more liability than asset, as their presence reminded everyone of the destruction that dragon civil war had brought to the realm. The dragons that lived through the remaining years of the 2nd century after conquest showed increasingly troubling signs of genetic decline. Each new generation hatched smaller and weaker than their predecessors. Their lifespans shortened and their reproductive capabilities diminished by generations of inbreeding within a limited genetic pool. The maesters who studied these creatures documented progressive deterioration in both physical capabilities and mental acuity, suggesting that the dragon bloodline was approaching biological collapse. The last dragon to achieve significant size during this period was appropriately named the Last Dragon, though even this creature failed to approach the proportions that had characterized earlier generations. His death in 153 AC marked the official end of dragons in Westeros, though rumors persisted for years afterward of eggs that might hatch and hatchlings that might survive to adulthood. These hopes proved false, as subsequent attempts to restore dragon populations failed repeatedly, producing only malformed creatures that died within days or weeks of hatching. The political consequences of dragon extinction became apparent immediately, as rebellions erupted across the realm when ambitious lords realized that Targaryen power no longer carried the threat of dragonfire. The Blackfire rebellions, regional uprisings, and constant challenges to royal authority demonstrated how completely the dynasty's governance had depended upon supernatural enforcement. Without dragons to inspire fear and respect, Targaryen kings found themselves reduced to the same political limitations that constrained other royal houses. The empty dragon pit became a monument to lost power and vanished magic, its great chambers echoing with memories of roars that would never again shake the foundations of King's Landing. Visitors to the abandoned structure reported an atmosphere of profound melancholy, as if the very stones mourned the absence of the creatures they had been built to house. The dragon skulls displayed in the Red Keep's throne room served as reminders of what the dynasty had once commanded, their empty eye sockets staring down upon kings who ruled through conventional means. The transformation of Westeros during the century following dragon extinction revealed how profoundly these creatures had influenced the realm's political and social development. Without the threat of dragonfire to enforce royal edicts, regional lords gained increasing autonomy, while traditional feudal relationships reasserted themselves. The great houses that had submitted to dragon power began testing the limits of royal authority, leading to conflicts that drained the crown's resources and weakened central governance. The maesters and scholars who had once studied living dragons now focused their attention on preserving knowledge about these extinct creatures, transcribing ancient texts, and interviewing elderly survivors who remembered the great dragons in their prime. Their efforts created detailed records of dragon behavior, breeding practices, and care requirements, though this knowledge served more as historical documentation than practical guidance. The irony was not lost on these learned men that they possessed more comprehensive understanding of dragon nature than ever before, yet lacked any living specimens to which this knowledge could be applied. The economic impact of dragon extinction affected every aspect of Westerosi society, as industries that had developed around dragon care and feeding disappeared overnight. Dragon keepers found themselves without purpose, while craftsmen who had specialized in dragon-related equipment discovered that their skills were no longer needed. The psychological adjustment proved equally challenging, as people struggled to adapt to a world where the greatest powers were once again merely human rather than magical. The religious implications of dragon extinction sparked theological debates that continued for generations as septons and scholars attempted to understand what the disappearance of these creatures meant for the realm's spiritual life. Some interpreted dragon extinction as divine judgment against the Targaryen dynasty's practice of sibling marriage and their claims to rule through supernatural mandate. Others argued that the dragons had simply fulfilled their purpose in uniting the Seven Kingdoms, their departure marking the beginning of a new era in which humanity would govern itself without magical intervention. The preservation of dragon eggs in the Red Keep's deepest vaults represented the dynasty's desperate hope that their lost power might someday return. These calcified remnants of ancient magic were treated with reverence and subjected to countless revival attempts, using methods ranging from traditional fire ceremonies to experimental alchemical processes. Each failure reinforced the growing acceptance that the Age of Dragons had truly ended, though the eggs remained as symbols of what the Targaryen family had once commanded and might someday reclaim. Nearly 3 centuries passed between the death of the last dragon in King's Landing and the moment when fire and magic returned to a world that had forgotten their power. The Targaryen dynasty endured through these dragonless years, their rule maintained through conventional means while their ancient symbols gathered dust in forgotten chambers. The dragon skulls that adorned the Red Keep's throne room served as monuments to vanished glory, their empty eye sockets watching over kings who commanded armies instead of creatures, who ruled through politics rather than magic. Robert's rebellion in 283 AC finally ended the Targaryen dynasty's hold on the Iron Throne, scattering the remaining members of the royal family across the narrow sea as exiles and refugees. Prince Viserys and his infant sister Daenerys found themselves dependent upon the charity of allies and the protection of those who remembered old loyalties, their royal heritage reduced to little more than names and stories of ancient power. The 3 dragon eggs that accompanied them into exile represented the last tangible connection to their family's magical legacy, calcified remnants of creatures that had once ruled the skies. These dragon eggs, given as a wedding gift when Daenerys married Khal Drogo of the Dothraki, carried within them possibilities that no one in the known world believed could ever be realized. The eggs themselves were works of art, their shells displaying colors and patterns that spoke of the ancient craftsmanship of old Valyria. One bore scales of deep black touched with red, another gleamed with cream and gold, while the third showed green bronze that shifted in firelight like living metal. Yet, for all their beauty, they remained stone, their potential life locked away by centuries of dormancy. The Dothraki, a nomadic people who measured wealth in horses and strength in conquest, viewed these dragon eggs as curiosities rather than treasures of inestimable value. Their culture had no memory of dragons or understanding of what these artifacts represented, seeing them merely as exotic decorations that demonstrated their new Khaleesi's foreign origins. This dismissal would prove tragically ironic as events unfolded, revealing that the greatest treasure in the known world had been hiding among a people who recognized only conventional forms of power. Khal Drogo's death created the catalyst that would transform dormant possibility into miraculous reality. Daenerys, faced with the collapse of her position within Dothraki society and the certain death that awaited a Khaleesi without her Khal's protection, chose to embrace fire in a ritual that combined grief, desperation, and an intuitive understanding of magic that she could not fully explain. The funeral pyre that consumed her husband's body became something far greater when she added the 3 dragon eggs to the flames along with the Maigi Miri Maz Duor, whose blood magic had both saved and destroyed her husband. The magic that awakened within those flames transcended anything the known world had witnessed for nearly 3 centuries. As the fire consumed wood and flesh and bone, the ancient spells that had created dragon eggs began to stir within their calcified shells. The heat that should have destroyed these stone artifacts instead activated processes that had lain dormant since the doom of Valyria, restoring life to creatures whose bloodline connected them directly to the dragons of conquest and civil war. When Daenerys emerged from the ashes unburned and cradling 3 newly hatched dragons, the moment marked more than personal survival or magical rebirth. The return of dragons to the world represented the restoration of forces that had shaped civilization itself, powers that had been thought lost forever to death and time. The 3 hatchlings that clung to their new mother carried within their blood the genetic legacy of Balerion and Vhagar, of Meraxes and Vermithor, of all the great dragons whose deaths had seemed to mark the end of magic in the world. Drogon, the largest and most aggressive of the 3, displayed the black scales and red eyes that immediately marked him as Balerion's spiritual successor. Even as a hatchling, his temperament revealed the fierce independence and natural dominance that would characterize his growth into the largest dragon the world had seen since the conquest. His bond with Daenerys proved immediate and absolute. their connection transcending the normal relationships between rider and mount to approach something resembling the legendary partnerships of ancient Valyria. Rhaegal, named in honor of Daenerys' deceased brother, showed green and bronze coloring that recalled the great dragons of earlier eras, while developing a personality that balanced aggression with intelligence. The dragon's responses to human emotion and his ability to distinguish between friend and enemy suggested the complex awareness that had made dragons such effective partners to their Targaryen riders throughout history. His growth during their early months together revealed both the rapid development that characterized healthy dragon bloodlines and the potential that lay dormant within properly cared for hatchlings. Viserion, the smallest of the three but possessed of unusual beauty with his cream and gold scales, demonstrated the gentleness that had marked some of the most beloved dragons in Targaryen history. His temperament recalled Silverwing's peaceful nature and Syrax's regal bearing, suggesting that the genetic diversity preserved within the dragon eggs had maintained the full range of dragon personalities and capabilities. The combination of different temperaments within a single clutch offered hope that future breeding might restore the varied dragon populations that had once served the Targaryen dynasty. The early months of the dragons' lives revealed both the challenges and rewards of raising these creatures without the institutional knowledge that had guided previous generations of dragon keepers. Daenerys relied on instinct and ancient texts to understand her dragon's needs, learning through trial and error what foods they required and how their growth could be properly supported. The absence of experienced keepers meant that every aspect of dragon care required rediscovery, from feeding schedules to training methods to the subtle signs that indicated health problems or emotional distress. As the dragons grew, their presence began to attract attention from those who remembered old prophecies and ancient lore. The Dothraki warriors, who had initially dismissed the eggs as worthless curiosities, now watched in awe as creatures of legend took flight above their camps. The dragons' hunting expeditions provided food for the Khaleesi's growing following while demonstrating capabilities that surpassed even the most optimistic expectations of their potential. The relationship between Daenerys and her three dragons evolved as they matured together, their bonds deepening through shared experiences and mutual dependence. Each dragon developed distinct preferences and behaviors that reflected both individual personality and their collective response to their mother's guidance. Drogon showed the strongest independent streak, often ranging far from camp to hunt alone, while Rhaegal and Viserion remained closer to their siblings and demonstrated greater willingness to accept direction from their human guardian. The dragons' role in Daenerys' conquest of Slaver's Bay revealed both their military effectiveness and the psychological impact they created among populations that had no memory of such creatures. The sieges of Astapor, Yunkai, and Meereen demonstrated that dragons retained all their legendary capabilities despite their centuries of absence from the world, their flames proving as devastating to enemy fortifications as they had been during Aegon's conquest of Westeros. Yet these victories also revealed the challenges of controlling creatures whose power could easily exceed their riders' intentions. The locking away of Rhaegal and Viserion in the depths of Meereen's Great Pyramid represented Daenerys' growing understanding of the responsibilities that accompanied dragon mastery. The death of a child caused by Drogon's independent hunting forced her to confront the reality that these magnificent creatures posed constant danger to innocent people, regardless of their riders' good intentions. The decision to confine two of her dragons while allowing Drogon to remain free reflected both practical necessity and the painful recognition that dragon power required constant vigilance and control. The psychological impact of confinement upon Rhaegal and Viserion demonstrated the emotional complexity that characterized dragon intelligence. Both creatures showed clear signs of distress at their separation from their sibling and their enforced isolation from the wider world. Their behavior during captivity included attempts to escape, periods of depression marked by reduced appetite and activity, and increased aggression toward their captors that reflected frustration rather than mere animal instinct. Drogon's continued freedom during this period allowed him to develop in ways that his confined siblings could not, his independent hunting and flying creating a level of self-sufficiency that recalled the wild dragons of Valyrian history. His regular returns to visit Daenerys demonstrated the strength of their bond, while his tolerance for her other companions showed the social intelligence that made dragons such effective partners when properly managed. The Black Dragon's growth accelerated during these months of freedom, his size approaching proportions that had not been seen since the Conquest era. The journey of Daenerys Targaryen and her 3 dragons across the narrow sea to Westeros marked the return of magical power to a realm that had adapted to centuries of purely human governance. The landing at Dragonstone carried profound symbolic weight, as dragons once again perched upon the volcanic peaks where their ancestors had waited before conquering 7 kingdoms. Yet this homecoming occurred in a world fundamentally changed from the one that had known dragon rule, its political structures and social expectations having evolved during the long absence of supernatural enforcement. The dragons themselves seemed to recognize the significance of their return to ancestral lands, their behavior displaying heightened awareness and energy that their keepers in Essos had never observed. Drogon circled the towers of Dragonstone with proprietary interest, his black form cutting through Atlantic mists as he explored caves and perches that had once housed Balerion and his kin. Rhaegal and Viserion, finally freed from their confinement in Marine's Pyramid, reveled in the volcanic environment that seemed to strengthen their connection to forces that had shaped their bloodline for millennia. The political landscape that greeted their arrival bore little resemblance to the unified realm that dragons had once commanded. The War of the 5 Kings had fragmented central authority while creating new power centers that owed no loyalty to Targaryen claims or dragon heritage. Queen Cersei Lannister ruled from King's Landing with the backing of foreign gold and sellsword companies, her authority challenged by multiple claimants who possessed armies but lacked the supernatural mandate that had once made royal commands irresistible. The dragons' first encounters with Westerosi forces revealed both their continued tactical supremacy and the technological adaptations that had developed during their absence. The Scorpion ballistae that various armies deployed against them represented centuries of theoretical planning for conflicts that military engineers had never expected to fight. These weapons, while capable of inflicting serious wounds on even large dragons, required exceptional accuracy and favorable circumstances to prove effective against creatures whose speed and intelligence allowed them to adapt quickly to new threats. The expedition beyond the Wall provided the first test of dragon power against supernatural enemies, revealing that these creatures retained their effectiveness against magical threats as well as conventional armies. The journey to rescue Jon Snow and his companions from the army of the dead carried Daenerys and her dragons into territory that no Targaryen had explored since the earliest days of their exile from Valyria. The lands beyond the Wall challenged both rider and mounts, with conditions that tested their endurance and revealed aspects of dragon nature that peaceful times had never demanded. Viserion's death at the hands of the Night King represented more than a tactical loss. It marked the beginning of corruption that would transform one of Daenerys' children into a weapon against everything she fought to protect. The ice spear that pierced the cream and gold dragon's neck carried with it magical forces that perverted the natural order of life and death, creating an abomination that retained draconic power, while serving masters whose goals opposed all living things. The resurrection of Viserion as an ice dragon demonstrated that even creatures of fire and magic remained vulnerable to forces that transcended conventional understanding. The transformed Viserion's assault on the Wall at Eastwatch by the Sea achieved in moments what the Night King's forces had been unable to accomplish in millennia of attempts. The undead dragon's blue flames, cold as winter itself, melted the ancient ice barrier that had protected the realm since the Age of Heroes. This breakthrough allowed the army of the dead to pour south into the 7 kingdoms, bringing with them a threat that conventional armies could never hope to defeat without supernatural assistance. The Battle of Winterfell tested the surviving dragons against enemies that felt no fear and knew no pain, revealing both the advantages and limitations of dragon power when facing supernatural opponents. Drogon and Rhaegal fought with desperate fury against wights that swarmed like insects, their flames proving devastatingly effective against individual enemies while struggling to contain the sheer numbers that the Night King commanded. The dragons' intelligence served them well in this battle as they learned to coordinate their attacks and support ground forces through tactical strikes that cleared entire sections of the battlefield. The confrontation between Drogon and the undead Viserion above Winterfell's burning towers created one of the most tragic moments in dragon history, as brother faced brother in combat that neither could avoid. The living dragon's anguish at fighting his transformed sibling was apparent to all who witnessed their aerial battle. Drogon's attacks lacking the ruthless efficiency he had shown against other enemies. The death of the Night King and the subsequent collapse of Viserion provided relief from supernatural threat while creating grief that Drogon carried for the remainder of his life. The flight south toward King's Landing revealed changes in Rhaegal's condition that would soon prove fatal as the green and bronze dragon showed increasing signs of distress from wounds received during the battle against the Prior. Dead. His flight patterns became erratic, while his responses to Daenerys' commands grew delayed and uncertain, suggesting internal injuries that were not immediately apparent to his concerned rider. The dragon's determination to continue serving despite his pain reflected the loyalty that had characterized dragon partnerships throughout Targaryen history. Rhaegal's death during the approach to Dragonstone shocked all who witnessed it, as Euron Greyjoy's hidden scorpion batteries achieved what seemed impossible through coordinated volleys that struck the wounded dragon with devastating precision. The green and bronze dragon's fall into the narrow sea marked another tragic loss for Daenerys, while demonstrating that even experienced dragons remained vulnerable to well-planned ambushes using weapons specifically designed for their destruction. The sight of Rhaegal's massive form disappearing beneath the waves created grief and rage that would influence every decision Daenerys made thereafter. The burning of King's Landing represented the ultimate corruption of dragon power as Drogon, responding to his rider's emotional breakdown and desire for vengeance, unleashed destruction upon a city that had surrendered rather than continuing resistance. The Black Dragon's systematic demolition of neighborhoods filled with innocent civilians marked a return to the darkest applications of dragon power, recalling the worst excesses of Maegor the Cruel, while exceeding them in scope and senseless brutality. The flames that consumed the capital destroyed not just buildings and lives, but the moral foundation that had justified Targaryen rule for centuries. The death of Daenerys Targaryen at the hands of Jon Snow created the final tragedy in a series of losses that had systematically eliminated every aspect of the restored dragon dynasty. Drogon's response to his rider's assassination revealed the emotional depth that characterized dragon intelligence as he destroyed the Iron Throne itself, rather than accepting a new master. The melting of the symbol of Westeros' power represented both grief and judgment, the dragon's actions suggesting an understanding that the throne had become corrupted beyond redemption. Drogon's departure from Westeros with Daenerys' body marked the end of the brief dragon restoration, and perhaps the final chapter in the long history of dragon-human partnerships. The great black dragon's flight toward the distant horizon carried with him the last living connection to old Valyria and the magical traditions that had shaped civilization itself. His destination remained unknown to those who watched him disappear into the eastern sky, though many suspected he would seek the ancient lands where dragons had first learned to serve human ambition and where their kind might find peace at last. In the mists of ancient history, long before the Seven Kingdoms existed as we know them, the Valyrian freehold stood as the greatest civilization the world had ever known. Built upon 40 families of dragon lords who wielded fire and blood as their birthright, this empire stretched across continents, its reach extending far beyond the smoking peninsula that gave it birth. The dragons that served these lords were creatures of pure magic, born from the fusion of fire and blood in rituals lost to time. Their scales gleamed like precious metals, their breath could melt stone, and their very presence commanded the elements themselves. Among the 40 families who ruled this magnificent empire, House Targaryen held a position of respect, though not supreme power. They were neither the greatest nor the most influential of the Dragonlord houses, yet they possessed something that would prove more valuable than political dominance or military might. Within their bloodline flowed the gift of prophetic dreams, visions that could pierce the veil between present and future. This ancient magic manifested most powerfully in their daughters, women who bore the title of dreamers, and whose visions shaped the family's destiny across generations. The dragons of Valyria were not mere animals, but partners in the truest sense, their intelligence rivaling that of their riders. Each dragon possessed its own personality, its own preferences and bonds that transcended simple training. The connection between dragon and rider formed through bloodline and ritual, creating partnerships that lasted lifetimes. These magnificent creatures came in countless varieties, their scales displaying every color imaginable from deepest black to purest white, from emerald green to royal purple. Some grew to enormous size, their wingspans stretching across entire city blocks, while others remained smaller but no less deadly for their compact frames. The Targaryens maintained 5 great dragons in their household, each a testament to their family's power and prestige. Balerion, even then known for his massive size and black scales, served as the mount of Lord Aerion Targaryen. Vhagar, with her bronze coloring and fierce temperament, had bonded with Lady Valena Velaryon before her marriage into the Targaryen line. Meraxes, beautiful and swift with silver scales that caught the light like quicksilver, flew with various family members as need demanded. 2 other dragons whose names have been lost to history completed their stable. Creatures whose bloodlines would have enriched the Valyrian dragon population for generations to come. The gift of prophetic sight that marked the Targaryen bloodline reached its greatest expression in Daenerys Targaryen, a young woman whose visions would save her entire family from destruction. Born into privilege and power in the heart of the Freehold, Daenerys began experiencing dreams of unusual clarity and disturbing content. Night after night, she witnessed visions of fire and ash, of the great city of Valyria consumed in flames that burned so hot they melted stone and metal into rivers of molten destruction. In her dreams, she saw the 40 families perish, their dragons falling from the sky like burning stars, their great palaces crumbling into the earth as volcanic fury reshaped the very landscape. These visions tormented Daenerys for months as she struggled to understand their meaning. The images were too vivid to dismiss as mere nightmares, too consistent to ignore as fantasy. She saw the 14 flames, the ring of volcanoes that surrounded Valyria, erupting in unison with a violence that defied comprehension. She witnessed the sea boiling, turning to steam as molten rock poured into its depths. Most terrifying of all, she saw her own family among the victims unless they acted upon her warnings. When Daenerys finally shared her visions with her father, Lord Aenar Targaryen, the family faced an impossible decision. To abandon Valyria meant leaving behind everything they had built over centuries of careful cultivation. Their estates, their political alliances, their position within the Freehold's hierarchy would all be forfeit. Yet Daenerys spoke with such conviction, described her dreams with such horrifying detail, that Lord Aenar could not dismiss them as the fantasies of a troubled mind. The gift of prophetic sight ran strong in Targaryen blood, and her father had learned to trust the visions that came to their family's dreamers. The decision to leave Valyria required careful planning and tremendous sacrifice. The family could not simply announce their departure without raising questions that might panic other noble houses or alert rivals to their prophetic abilities. Instead, they began a gradual withdrawal, selling properties discreetly and transferring assets to their holdings on Dragonstone. This ancient fortress, perched on a volcanic island in Blackwater Bay, had served as their westernmost outpost for generations. Its remote location and defensible position made it ideal for what they planned to attempt. The most challenging aspect of their exodus involved the dragons themselves. Moving 5 adult dragons required exceptional secrecy and coordination. Each creature needed to be transported without drawing attention from the other Dragon Lord families who might question such unusual activity. The Targaryens accomplished this feat through a series of carefully planned flights, spacing the departures over several months to avoid suspicion. Balerion, already the largest of their dragons, required special consideration due to his immense size and the attention his flight would inevitably attract. As the family completed their preparations, Daenerys continued to experience her prophetic dreams with increasing intensity. The visions showed not just the destruction of Valyria, but glimpses of what lay beyond that catastrophe. She saw dragons flying over lands of ice and fire, witnessed great battles fought in skies above foreign kingdoms, and observed crown and throne that would one day bear the mark of Targaryen rule. These images both terrified and inspired her, suggesting that their exile would lead not to obscurity but to destiny beyond imagination. The final departure from Valyria proved emotional for every family member. Lord Aenar took one last look at the Great Pyramid that had housed his ancestors for centuries, while his wife, Lady Valena, whispered farewell to the garden where their children had played. Their young son, Aegon, barely more than a boy, watched the receding coastline with tears in his eyes, unable to understand why they were abandoning the only home he had ever known. Only Daenerys felt relief as the familiar skyline disappeared behind them, knowing that her family had escaped the doom that awaited their former neighbors. The journey to Dragonstone took several days as the dragons carried their riders and essential possessions across the summer sea. The family's treasure, accumulated over generations of service to the freehold, filled the cargo holds of ships that followed in the dragon's wake. Ancient tomes of dragon lore, weapons forged with Valyrian steel, and artifacts of power accompanied them into exile. Most precious of all were the dragon eggs they brought, some quickened with life and others waiting for the proper time to hatch. Dragonstone welcomed them with the familiar scent of sulfur and salt spray, its massive towers carved from the living rock of the mountainside. The castle's dragon motifs, sculpted by craftsmen who understood the creature's true nature, seemed appropriate for their new circumstances. Here they would rebuild. Here they would wait. And here they would prepare for whatever future Daenerys continued to glimpse in her dreams. The fortress became their sanctuary, its halls echoing with dragon roars instead of the refined conversations of Valyrian court life. 12 years passed in relative quiet as the Targaryens established their new life on Dragonstone. Their dragons thrived in the volcanic environment, finding caves and perches among the island's peaks where they could rest between flights. The family maintained their traditions and customs, teaching their children the High Valyrian tongue and the ancient ways of dragon mastery. They remained in contact with some Valyrian merchants and maintained awareness of political developments in their former homeland, though they took care to avoid drawing attention to their exile. Then, in a single day, Daenerys' prophecy fulfilled itself with horrifying accuracy. The doom of Valyria struck without warning as the 14 flames erupted simultaneously, their combined fury reshaping the very geography of the known world. The great city vanished beneath rivers of molten rock, while tsunamis devastated coastlines thousands of miles away. The 40 Dragonlord families perished in minutes, their centuries of accumulated power and knowledge lost forever. The dragons that had once filled the skies above Valyria fell dead or fled mad into the wilderness, their magic broken by the cataclysmic forces unleashed beneath their feet. When the news reached Dragonstone weeks later through traumatized survivors and fleeing merchants, the Targaryen family gathered in the castle's great hall to mourn their former homeland. Lord Aenar spoke of relatives and friends who had dismissed his daughter's warnings, while Lady Valena wept for the gardens and libraries that would never bloom again. Yet beneath their grief lay the profound realization that they had become something unique in all the world. House Targaryen now stood as the last Dragonlords, the sole keepers of the ancient bond between human and dragon. Their 5 surviving dragons represented the entire remaining population of these magical creatures. Balerion had grown even larger during their years of exile, his black scales gleaming with health and his temperament mellowing into the confidence of absolute dominance. Vhagar continued to display the fierce loyalty that had marked her service to the family, her bronze coloring deepening with age and experience. Meraxes maintained her elegant beauty, her silver scales catching the light of Dragonstone's torches as she glided between the castle's towers. The 2 unnamed dragons, though smaller than their famous companions, carried themselves with the dignity of creatures who knew their profound importance to their family's survival. The weight of their unique position began to settle upon the Targaryens as months turned to years. They were no longer simply one noble house among many, but the guardians of an entire species and the inheritors of knowledge that had died with Valyria. The responsibility proved both inspiring and terrifying, driving them to document everything they could remember about dragon care and breeding. They transcribed ancient songs, recorded feeding habits and mating behaviors, and preserved the rituals that bound dragon to rider through sacred ceremony and shared blood. As young Aegon matured into manhood during these years of isolation, his ambition grew alongside his understanding of their family's unprecedented position. The dreams that had saved them from destruction now showed him visions of conquest and crown, of dragons flying over castles that had never known their shadow. He watched the quarreling kingdoms of Westeros from afar, observing their endless wars and petty disputes with the calculating eye of a future conqueror. The boy who had wept at leaving Valyria was transforming into a man who would use their exile as the foundation for an empire greater than anything the Freehold had achieved. The transformation of House Targaryen from Valyrian nobles to the last Dragon Lords marked more than a change in circumstances. It represented the birth of a dynasty that would reshape the Western world. The beginning of a legend that would echo through centuries of conquest and civil war. In their isolation on Dragonstone, surrounded by the volcanic fury that mirrored their lost homeland, the family prepared for a destiny that none could yet fully comprehend. The dragons that had once been merely symbols of their status were becoming the instruments of a transformation that would unite 7 kingdoms under a single crown and establish a reign that would endure for nearly 3 centuries.